It's 7 o'clock in London, 9 o'clock in Kyiv, where a battle is underway for control of the capital as Russia's invasion of Ukraine enters a third day. Street fighting in Kyiv and gunfire and shelling heard in the capital here as Russian forces close in. In other towns and cities, heavy fighting continues between the Russian and Ukrainian armies. Shocking footage emerges of a shooting at a hospital in the southeast of the country.
The enemy will use all its forces to break our resistance. Vile, cruel and inhuman. The fate of Ukraine is being decided right now. Every civilian should be as careful as possible.
A UN Security Council resolution telling Moscow to stop attacking Ukraine and pull out its troops is vetoed by Russia. Anti-war protests are held across Russia. And thousands of protesters take to the streets in countries bordering Russia, calling for the invasion to stop. And the Ukrainian tennis player who wants to go back home and fight for his country.
I've actually signed up for reserves last week. I left here on Saturday. I don't have military experience. I do have gun experience, privately.
We'll have the latest throughout the morning, and we'll bring you all the newspapers and the press reviews with the former Moscow correspondent for The Guardian, Jonathan Steele, and the writer and broadcaster Benedict Spence. Good morning. Ukrainian forces are in a battle to hold Kyiv as Russian forces storm towards the capital here. Explosions have been heard in the city itself and heavy fighting has been reported in the surrounding areas. There are also reports this morning of fighting on the streets against Russian forces, with witnesses reporting hearing gunfire close to the government quarters in central Kyiv. Across the country, many cities are under attack from Russian heavy artillery and ground forces. Footage has emerged of shootings and bombings at hospitals. The Ukrainian president says he wants a ceasefire and peace, but it seems he himself is one of Vladimir Putin's main targets. These are the latest developments as Russia's invasion enters a third day. Russian troops are closing in on Kyiv with explosions and gunfire heard in the capital overnight. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has appealed for a ceasefire and warned that multiple cities were under attack. Residents have been urged to arm themselves to help fend off invaders. Meanwhile, a UN Security Council resolution telling Moscow to stop attacking Ukraine and withdraw all troops immediately was vetoed by Russia. The vote was 11-1, though, with China, India and the United Arab Emirates abstaining. Dominic Waghorn has this report.
Kyiv's Maidan Square. Crucible of Ukraine's people power revolution, menaced through the night by the sound of constant gunfire and explosions. The fighting is coming closer and closer to the centre. This is thought to have been filmed on one of the main routes into the city, burning vehicles on Peremyhy or Victory Avenue. Across the capital, the sound of explosions through the night, as Ukraine's president issued this call to arms to his people.
Tonight, the enemy will use all its forces to break our resistance. Vile, cruel and inhuman. Tonight, they will storm. Anyone who has already joined the defence of the country or can help the defence, stop the enemy wherever you can.
More apocalyptic scenes sear the night sky in the south of the country. The city of Mykolaiv lit up by a huge fireball. Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues relentlessly, columns of armour streaming through its highways. And with them reports of atrocities. This is reportedly an attack on a hospital in Melitopol. In Kyiv, Ukrainian forces are deploying as the Russians encircle their city. Fighting in these residential areas could lead to huge civilian loss of life. The mass exodus from the capital continues, people rushing to flee their beleaguered city, seeking safety further west. Scenes Europe hasn't witnessed for 80 years played out as Russia's unprovoked attack on its neighbour continues without restraint.
Our diplomatic affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, joins me now from Moscow. And Dominic, with all the condemnation, the economic sanctions, the UN Security Council meeting with China abstaining, President Putin is cutting an isolated figure.
Yeah, more and more pariah status beckons for Russia, losing all those sporting venues and events yesterday, and also barred from the Eurovision Song Contest. Ignominies of ignominies. And I think, that's something that will be weighing on the minds of Russians, but not probably Vladimir Putin or the elites surrounding him. He seems hell-bent on invading and occupying and taking over Ukraine. And he's making some progress in that respect, but not the progress that you might think he might be expecting. He's taken the town of Melitopol, not without an attack on the town's hospital, tactics that we saw Russian military carry out in Syria with devastating effect, attacking one hospital after another there. Well, they seem to have attacked a hospital in Melitopol, shelling the building and killing 4, injuring 10, and the use of cluster bombs as well, according to Human Rights Watch there. They have taken that, but they've had a pretty big setback in the downing of another Ilyushin 76 transport plane. They've lost 2 of those now, and American officials believe that on board the second one were 100 paratroopers. That's a major setback, a big, significant setback for Vladimir Putin. And I think it raises the question as to why is he using these higher-risk tactics? Why is he using paratroopers when he could simply roll his way into Ukraine with these armoured columns? And I think it probably could be answered by the theory that he's probably going for a quicker success than that kind of slower success he'd get with the armoured column progress and advances. He may well be going for the kind of blitzkrieg operation that analysts have said he needs to deliver the Russian people. If he can't be quickly successful and deliver on a swift, decisive victory, then public sentiment in Russia is going to move away from him. So that may be why he's been using these high-risk tactics, using paratroopers and trying to seize these airports that he could then fly in forces in considerable numbers to then encircle cities. Now, that may be a sign of the progress he's aiming towards, but he does seem to be achieving it so far, and he has been pushed back by stiff Ukrainian resistance. Now, that may be leading to frustration, and Western officials in a troubling briefing yesterday said they were worried that he is so frustrated, his commanders are so frustrated, they may be considering more drastic weaponry, using things like thermobaric bombs. Thermobaric bombs are devastating. They suck in oxygen, they deprive anyone around them of oxygen, but they also cause much bigger shock waves, which are devastating for people around them. If he were to use those in residential areas, it would be devastating, but Western officials say they are worried that he is so frustrated with the pace of his progress, he may be considering resorting to them. I have to treat that with some scepticism, of course. There is an information war going on, but that's what Western officials are telling us.
OK, Dominic, thank you very much. So let's have a closer look now at where this battle is being fought across this country. Well, according to UK defence intelligence, Russian forces are coming from 2 directions into this city, or the outskirts of the city, in order to surround it. Heavy fighting has been reported at Hostomel Air Base to the capital's northwest. Its control has apparently been switching back and forth as fighting continues around that airfield. Looking at the country more broadly, well, fighting has been reported in many towns and cities, of course. Russian troops are mostly concentrated, though, in 3 areas. This is consistent with reports that Ukrainian forces have said that Russian military vehicles have crossed the border in the north near Kharkiv, as well as entering from Belarus up in the northwest. Russian artillery has also been coming from annexed Crimea, part of Ukraine, or was, and still is. But a short while ago, the Ukrainian President Zelensky released a video that suggests he is still in this city.
Всім доброго ранку, українці.
Good morning to everyone, Ukrainians. Lately, there has been a lot of fake information online that I called on our army to lay down arms and to evacuate. Listen, I am here. We will not lay down the weapons. We will defend our state, because our weapon is our truth. And the truth is that this is our land, our country, our children. And we will defend all of that. That's all that I wanted to tell you. Glory to Ukraine.
And joining me now is the Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey. Good morning to you from Kyiv. And it seems that the Ukrainians are still holding out, still defending this city against Putin's military. They are putting up quite a fight.
They certainly are. In fact, we in the MOD don't recognise Dominic's report that Melitopol has fallen to the Russians. As far as we're concerned, all of Russia's main day one objectives of Kharkiv, Kherson, Chernihiv, Mariupol, Sumy and Melitopol are still in Ukrainian hands. And what you're seeing in Kiev at the moment are very isolated pockets of Russian special forces and paratroopers. The main armoured columns approaching Kiev are still some way off. And that is a testament to the incredible resistance that the Ukrainian armed forces have put up over the last 48 hours or so.
Yeah, I mean, that would seem to be right as regards Kiev. Certainly the fighting we're hearing is on the outskirts of the city, some small arms fighting more centrally. But the fear has to be, given it is this massive Russian army, that a much bigger, more dangerous assault on this city is about to occur in the coming hours and days.
Well, I think that's right. Clearly, the Russian plan is to take Kyiv, but the reality is that the Ukrainians are thwarting them thus far, and that is an incredible effort on their part. And that brings into play all sorts of challenges for Russia. They will need to start to consider how they will resupply the troops that have taken longer to get down to Kyiv than they thought. They will need to resupply those who have been engaged in very fierce combat all around other Ukrainian cities. So there's a challenge for the Kremlin that I'm not sure that we think they necessarily thought they would have to work their way through. And that is potentially an opportunity for the Ukrainians to fight back even more. We'll see what happens. Look, it's a very grave situation, but from our perspective here in the MOD, from what we're picking up from the Ukrainians, from what we're seeing through the various ways that we see things, it looks like the Russian plan is nowhere near running to schedule, and I think that will be a great cause for concern for President Putin, and rather points to the fact that there was an awful lot of hubris in the Russian plan, and that he may well be awfully advised.
Well, I mean, the bottom line is he has a very powerful military, and he could turn the awesome power of that military on this city anytime he wants. I mean, are you still trying to get arms in to help the Ukrainian forces?
We are very much trying to get lethal aid to the Ukrainians. The UK convened a donor conference yesterday evening, chaired by Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State. 25 countries attended, many of whom, as a consequence of that, committed to either humanitarian or lethal aid, which the UK will now work with allies to make sure is delivered. Whereas a few weeks ago, we were able to be quite open about the fact that we were delivering NLAW and we were able to facilitate media coverage of its arrival. As you will appreciate, Mark, the situation is now somewhat different, and so the detail of what we're giving and when is probably something that we need to keep to ourselves. But Ukrainian calls have been heard. We've seen, as you will have seen, how much the Ukrainian armed forces have valued using the NLAW anti-tank weapon that we provided last time round, and there's anecdotal evidence that that has been very successful in battle. So we know what the Ukrainians want. We're doing our best to get it to them, but I'm afraid it's probably not detail that we can share with any sort of candor, I'm afraid.
Suffice to say, though, are you confident that you can get this equipment in?
Yes.
If the Russians do come in and topple this government, a freely elected democratic government, what would the West do to reverse that?
Well, I think that that is the sort of two parts to the challenge. Our previous conversation about is what do you do immediately to try to assist in the Ukrainian attempts to repel the Russian advance. And as we've been very clear throughout, that isn't, I think, about NATO troops playing an active role in the conflict, but is very much about looking at how we support the Ukrainian armed forces. The longer-term competition with Russia.
Sorry to interrupt. This is a situation in which, you know, Russia is controlling this country. So, if you're still going to support the Ukrainian armed forces, are you saying that you would support and recognise a government in exile, and you would support and arm a resistance movement wherever that was being located and based?
Well, that is a decision for the National Security Council to take, but it is something that the Prime Minister has asked us in the Ministry of Defence to look at and plan for, so that the National Security Council has that choice to make if and when that time comes. But I was going to go on to reflect that actually Putin has a further aim beyond territorial gain in Ukraine, which is around fracturing the NATO alliance and pushing NATO away from Russia's borders. There's obviously things that the Secretary-General has announced over the last 24 hours to make sure that Putin gets the opposite to what he wants. But then there is a 10, 20-year project, I think, where the West will be back into quite acute competition with Russia, where imposing cost on Putin, the kleptocrats that surround him, so that he fails and he is seen to fail and he has no opportunity to anoint his successor, and Russia fundamentally changes as a country as a consequence because the Russian people just have had enough of him. That is something where I think the UK and our allies have got time to make good strategic decisions rather than necessarily needing to kind of rush. So there's the urgency of supporting the Ukrainians in what they're doing right now, and then there's making good strategic decisions around how we make sure that Putin really does fail as a consequence of the hubris he's shown over the last week or two.
But just finally, it is highly likely, it sounds, or is what you're saying, that you would recognise a government in exile and help arm a resistance military, a resistance army.
No, you're putting words in my mouth, Mark, and I need to be very clear. As a Ministry of Defence Minister,
you said it would be a decision for the national security.
Exactly. So as a Ministry of Defence Minister, I am telling you that the Prime Minister has asked to be able to have that choice at his disposal, and that is work that the Ministry of Defence is undertaking to look at how we would do that. But it is definitely not for me to give you any level of probability. That is a decision, rightly, that sits with the Prime Minister and the National Security Council.
OK, James Heapy, appreciate your time this morning on what could be a very difficult day for this country. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, Deborah Haynes, our Security and Defence Editor, is with me. So, well, there's a lot to go at. They still want to get arms in for the military here now, and if the government is toppled, they are going to consider, clearly, arming some sort of resistance operation and you know, backing a government in exile.
Yes, it's the one thing, isn't it, that we keep hearing from the Ukrainian side, is that they say they've got the manpower, they've got the will to fight, but they need weapons. And so really interesting that Ben Wallace, the UK Defence Secretary, held this virtual donor conference yesterday evening to get support. And also I understand that some of the countries on that call were those that had actually previously been against supplying lethal aid to Ukraine, but that actually they've now changed their mind since President Putin invaded its neighbour. And in terms of the actual aid that we're talking about, it's things like ammunition, anti-tank missiles, anti-air weapons, and then things like medical supplies as well, much needed medical supplies. The question is, though, whether it's going to be enough. And like you said, things are looking pretty dangerous today. We've heard explosions through the night, gunfire here in the capital. So you do really wonder how this day will end, although it wasn't as
I don't think I mean, you're right. It is day, and there is fighting outside. But a major assault on this capital city has not happened yet.
Exactly, and I think that's the other takeaway from what the Armed Forces Minister was saying. He clearly, people believe that the Russian objectives are not going to the timetable that they'd planned. He listed a load of cities that he said Russia had intended to take on the first day. And as of now, Western officials say they don't believe that Russia has control of any of the main cities. So that is a significant setback if that really was the schedule that Vladimir Putin was working to. But as we were told by Western officials yesterday, they believe that as that timetable is impacted by the Ukrainian military's ability to defend their country, then the tempo of the firepower being launched against them and the potential indiscrimination of the weapons used could rise.
Exactly, and missiles are hitting areas on the outskirts of this capital. They're hitting buildings and people are dying.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, I went and visited an apartment block yesterday where there'd been some sort of missile strike right outside, totally destroyed, like a whole wall of 10-storey apartment blocks. Lives completely ruined, and it totally it just exposes the fallacy of the entire narrative that President Putin has built to justify this invasion, that he's somehow coming in to help save this country, where actually the opposite is true. He's coming in trying to enforce himself on this country, which had, under the government, been trying to build closer ties to the West, which is something that is seen in Moscow as an existential threat.
Yeah, absolutely. Deborah, thank you very much for the moment. We're turning now to other parts of the country and in Dnipro, down in southeastern Ukraine, where the Ukrainian government has said Russian airstrikes have been targeting a lot of military sites there, military facilities. We can join Sky's John Sparks, who is there on the ground for us. And John, Dnipro, not a city that's talked about in this a lot, but strategically quite important.
Yeah, that's right. Good morning, Mark. That's right. A major transport hub. It sort of stands in the centre of the country in the eastern section. Logistically important in terms of transport for troops and supplies and logistics. It's quiet here at the moment. It's eerily quiet. Very few people on the streets. But we know that in a city located very close to Dnipro called Poltava, it has been hit by the Russian version of the cruise missile fired from the Black Sea, along with a number of other cities, Sumy and Mariupol, Sumy in the northeast, Mariupol in the southeast. So it is a target. The outskirts of this city will certainly remain a target. And I think the focus of the Russian forces at the moment clearly is on the capital. The capital is essentially under siege. Gunfire being reported in main sections of the city, central train station, Maiden Square. And we have heard from city officials in Kyiv telling people to watch out because street fighting has started to take place in sections of the city. People are being told to take shelter immediately, to stay away from windows and balconies, to avoid flying debris and bullets. It gives you an idea of just how dangerous the situation there is as well. The US has reportedly offered to evacuate President Zelensky, although he hasn't taken them up on the offer. And there was a video that he released on Twitter. I mean, Zelensky very quickly becoming a global hero now. He released a short video saying, "Don't believe the fake news. I'm still here," still calling on Ukrainians to fight. US intelligence also warning, however, the Ukrainians that they believe the Russians have inserted hit squads into the capital to take Zelensky out. And I think there's every indication that that is true. President Putin quoted last night describing the Ukrainian government as a bunch of drug addicts and neo-Nazis. Of course, with all the fighting, there is still a refugee crisis now well underway. The UN's refugee agency, the UNHCR, say 50,000 people are on the move, have left their homes in the last 48 hours, many going south to Moldova, many more going west to Poland and also to Romania as well. The Polish president has said he will accept every Ukrainian refugee who comes to the border, and we're hearing that the queues at the border are 10 hours long or more. Also, the Romanians saying they have room for 500,000 refugees from Ukraine. Acts of extraordinary generosity, because that's what it is at a really dark time for Ukraine.
John, thank you very much. Let's just bring you some pictures that we're getting in. These are live pictures in Kyiv, on the outskirts of Kyiv, and what you can see there is a clearly damaged building, thought to be a residential building, and that is on the outskirts of Kyiv, close to the airport, we're told, and it's we don't know exactly what happened, but that residential block has clearly come under attack, and that is on the outskirts of Kyiv. They are live pictures this morning. Well, in the south, Russian attacks have spread along Ukraine's coastline amid suggestions that a new assault could soon be underway there. Alex Rossi reports now from Mariupol on the attack from the south.
It has been an horrific 24 hours. The hospital directors take me to see soldiers injured on the Eastern Front. Staff Lieutenant Andrei was lacerated with shrapnel. He's heavily medicated, but says as soon as he's recovered, he wants to fight again.
Попали под минометный обстрел, первые приняли удар на себя, после чего заняли свои места в окопе. Понимаем, что получили ранения. Видели, что проезжает мимо скорая помощь, решили не сильно геройствовать, решили, что немножко нас подлечили.
In another room, Vadim has just come out of surgery. He's in pain. Dr. Alexei says he expects to see many more blast injuries in the days to come.
Я думаю, сколько мы выдержим? 2-3 дня, 4, сколько простоим? Продержимся. Ну, может быть, надеемся, сегодня саммит НАТО или что там, может быть, они примут решение какое-то. Может, усадят его за стол переговоров, может, остановят стрельбу, переговорный процесс. Но мы делаем свою работу. Мы должны оказывать помощь, они должны защищать, а мы круглые сутки тут ждем, оперируем, помогаем, делаем свою работу.
But it's unlikely any help will arrive. Mariupol, like the rest of the country, is besieged and on its own. The people here are exhausted. They stay inside unless they need supplies. But after years of fighting, they're inured to the sound of war. Most don't even flinch when the shells start flying.
We're on the outskirts of Mariupol in the eastern district. The front lines are over in that direction. We've been listening to the sound of a very heavy artillery battle. It's hard to say exactly how far it is away, but it sounds as though Russian forces are getting now much closer to the city.
And as fear hovers over this place, a steady stream of evacuees are getting out whilst they can. This man's putting his wife and daughter on the train to safety before he goes back in the army.
Я раніше воював, військово підготовлений. Я чую свою зобов'язаність просто воювати. Ну, подальше, як країна прикаже.
Many families will be separated in the days to come. And with the Russian invasion battering every corner of this country, there's no doubt there will be many more tears. Alex Rossi, Sky News, Mariupol.
Well, a resolution condemning Moscow's invasion of Ukraine was vetoed at the United Nations Security Council, predictably by Russia. But China failed to back Vladimir Putin's actions, and sanctions against the Russian leader are growing. Here's our US correspondent, Mark Stone.
Battalion!
Along Europe's eastern flank, the latest deployment of soldiers. More Americans, part of a now growing NATO defence force. The order and the ceremony in such contrast to an upending of world order, which feels at least so real. And at the world's top diplomatic forum, an evening vote on a resolution condemning Russia.
Those against?
Which didn't pass, but did provide what's being seen as a significant moment.
Abstentions?
China, considered by Russia to be a friend, did not vote with them against the resolution. Beijing could not condone what's happening in Ukraine. Western diplomats finding success within a failed vote. They peeled apart two allies, getting a Chinese abstention, adding to Putin's isolation.
The resolution was supported by all member states of the European Union and many partners from around the world. Together with Ukraine, we will now work for the General Assembly to demand an immediate withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine.
Hi, everyone.
At the White House, a decision to match what the EU and UK had already done, to take sanctions further, to hit President Putin himself.
The president is doing nearly everything in his power to lead the world and stand up against the actions of President Putin. What he will not do is send U.S. troops to fight in Ukraine, because he is not going to put the American public, the American people, or the United States in a position of fighting a war with Russia.
And that's the nub of it. That's why NATO forces will not roll into Ukraine to end all this. It is about sanctions, now against Putin himself, freezing his assets, potentially banning him from travelling. Tactics that were once a deterrent now feel so reactionary, and against a man who isn't listening.
Are you worried for President Zelensky?
Of course he's worried, but the past few days has revealed the blunt and troubling reality. What can be done without unthinkable escalation? Mark Stone, Sky News, at the White House.
Well, protests against the Ukrainian invasion are growing in Russia and its surrounding countries. Thousands of protesters took to the streets in the Georgian capital, calling for an end to the invasion. Huge crowds gathered outside the parliament buildings there. They called for the resignation of Georgia's prime minister, who said his country would not join the West in sanctioning Russia. Anti-war demonstrations have taken place at more than 50 Russian cities. Police made a number of arrests in St. Petersburg, where those involved in a peaceful protest were grabbed by riot police and then arrested. That is Putin's home city. In Moscow, people came from across the city to mark another night of bombing here. They laid flowers and lit candles at the Ukrainian embassy. And in London, more than 1,000 people rallied outside Downing Street, chanting, "Russia, go home." Many were from Ukraine and were, well, clearly upset about the events going on in their country. A little earlier, Ukrainian President Zelensky released this video.
Всім доброго ранку, українці.
Good morning to everyone, Ukrainians. Lately, there has been a lot of fake information online that are called on our army to lay down arms and to evacuate. Listen, I am here. We will not lay down the weapons. We will defend our state, because our weapon is our truth. And the truth is that this is our land, our country, our children. And we will defend all of that. That's all that I wanted to tell you. Glory to Ukraine.
And that video, in fact, was recorded this morning, so President Zelensky clearly still in this city. Well, the invasion of Ukraine has drawn a sharp reaction from sporting bodies, many of which have been quick to distance themselves from Russia. I'm joined now by the chief football writer at The Times, Martin Ziegler. Thank you very much indeed for being with us, Martin. So football, it seems, is moving against Putin.
Yes, good morning, Mark. It's, unprecedented times and unprecedented response from sport, including football. UEFA have moved to strip St. Petersburg of the Champions League final in May. They've moved that to Paris. They're going to terminate a massive £80 million sponsorship deal with Gazprom. And in motor racing, the Formula One is being removed from Sochi in September. So, yes, I think almost united response from sport.
But Gazprom does remain, at the moment at least, the sort of major sponsor of the Champions League.
Yeah, from my understanding is that the UEFA's lawyers are working on this, and I think it's very unlikely we'll see any Gazprom advertising when the next round of matches take place.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, do you think a lot of this stuff will be kind of temporary, you know, take action, make a headline, and then, you know, money will talk in 6 months, a year, or 2 years or so?
I mean, I think, you know, it's going to very much depend on what happens. I mean, we have seen sort of the sporting world bending over to Russia over the last 10 years, if not longer. And the International Olympic Committee, FIFA, have all been very, very supportive of the regime. But I think, I mean, the sense I get is that there's been such shock amongst sporting circles that even those figures who are very keen on being pictured with Vladimir Putin in the past have realised actually things have got to change.
So where does all this leave, do you think, people like Abramovich at Chelsea, a man who's poured money into Chelsea? Where do you think there'll be some action down the line against people like that?
Well, there's certainly lots of concern amongst Abramovich's people that he is going to be on the next list to be targeted. I mean, there was an expectation because there were calls in the House of Commons that the government should step in and take action against him, and even remove Chelsea from his ownership. He's put £1.5 billion into the club, and as things stand, he can still keep going. He now has Portuguese and Israeli citizenship. So whether that's a factor too, it's quite difficult to know, but there's certainly concern around the club and his entourage.
And just finally, are you hearing any other moves that may be announced in sport relating to what is happening here in Ukraine?
Well, the fact the International Olympic Committee has called for all international sporting federations to remove events from Russia, I think is, I mean, I was amazed that they went that far, but they have done. So there are some, for example, the International Swimming Federation has not gone down that far. Volleyball has said they're still pressing ahead with the World Championships in Russia in the summer. But I think the pressure on those sports will become too intense for them to continue.
OK, Martin, thanks very much for being with us this morning. Appreciate your time. Thank you. Well, our sports presenter, Jackie Beltrao, joins me now from Sky News Centre. Good morning, Jackie. It does seem, on the face of it at least, that sport is doing its bit.
Yes, as one paper said yesterday, finding its moral compass, Mark. I've been chatting to a former Ukrainian tennis player, Sergei Stakhovsky, who retired just last month, actually, and he's been on a family holiday trying to get back to Kyiv. He thinks that sporting sanctions will really hurt Putin because he's all about the glory and the flag and the national anthems and showing just how great his country is through sport. Sporting sanctions will really, really hurt him. But he said, for the minute, it's not about sport. It's about fighting. He has put down his racket. He is trying to get back to Kyiv because he wants to pick up a gun.
I've actually signed up for reserves last week. I left Kyiv on Saturday. It makes a world of difference to our armed forces, I would say. Seeing that they're not left alone at least in a media environment. But let's be realistic here. It's been 8 years of the war since Russia. Whether it was Russia proxies or Russia itself, it doesn't matter. Where was all of this for the 8 years?
Other players have been speaking out as well, and the top 10 player, Elena Svitolina, now Elena Monfils, has been incredibly stressed. In that interview with Stokowski, he broke down at least twice. He's so worried about his family in Kyiv. And it's a very similar story for Ukrainian sports stars who are far away from their country right now.
For me, I almost didn't sleep for this 48 hours. I cannot even imagine what people going through when they close their eyes and they hear bombs, when they hear shooting outside their house. So for sure, you care. You are really nervous and really thinking about your family. So for me, it's completely normal that some people, some sportsmen taking time off. Me, I'm extremely nervous as well.
Yeah, all the sports stars incredibly stressed about what's going on back home. We've got Yarmolenko, who plays for West Ham, who's asked for a few days off. He's not going to be playing in their match against Wolves this weekend because, you know, honestly, how can you think about playing football or playing tennis or whatever it is when such a thing is going on back in your home country? And the level of stress coming through in these interviews is incredible.
OK, Jackie, thank you very much indeed. And we were just showing you pictures a few moments ago of a residential block here on the outskirts of this city. And we're just getting some information about what happened there. Those are the pictures. And clearly severe damage to that residential block. Well, the Ukrainian authorities are now saying that that was caused by a missile strike from Russia. But they also say, and it seems quite extraordinary looking at what we are seeing there, that there were no casualties. So in the midst of all this ghastly stuff going on, no casualties is some relief. That strike happening overnight, and that is a residential block over near the airport. So the Russians may well have been attacking that airport as they have been in the last few days. Well, Ukraine's Ministry of Defence has been urging citizens to arm themselves in order to fight off the invading forces. One of those who's taken up the call is the leader of the Golos Zemin political party, Kira Rudik, who posted this picture to social media saying that she had taught herself to use a Kalashnikov and was preparing to bear arms. And she joins me now from here in Kyiv. Thank you, Kira, for being with us this morning. And what is your understanding? I mean, it seems quite calm, clearly, in the centre. But what is your understanding of what is going on in this city at the moment?
So I live in Solomenska district. The shooting that hit the tall-story building is here, like 5-minute walk. And the night was really tough. You probably seen it yourself. We had at least 3 sirens during the night, 3 times when everybody had to go to the bomb shelters. And there were airstrikes on Kyiv. There were also about 60 people killed from the Russian side, and they will go back to where they came from in plastic bags. I think Putin right now understood how he underestimated Ukraine and Ukrainians in their ability to fight back. So we have our army who is strategically kicking Putin's back, and we have our resistance forces, which I'm a part of right now, who are fixing what went through the cracks through our army. And I think we are doing very well. We are very successful in it. And every morning we are waking up to a better hope. And every morning we are waking up to a better understanding of that we actually will win.
How long do you think you can hold out? How long can the Ukrainian forces, do you think, hold out against what is clearly a very powerful army?
So first of all, we are not alone. So we are getting support from countries all over the world and getting more and more weapons and financial support. So I think we still have a week or so to stand and fight for ourselves. Plus, I'm very sure that we will be fighting back and pushing them backwards and up to our borders. These couple of days, I think starting yesterday, are really, really hard. That's true. But it's also creating this force that is fighting Russians back from our side, the resistance force that is prevailing right now, that is stopping all the attempts to take the city, and that is regrouping right now to fight back and kick them away.
But Kira, I mean, the reality is that a much bigger onslaught, assault on this city may come in the coming hours and days, and then things could be very different. If that did happen, would you stay in the city?
I am Ukrainian MP and the leader of a political party. My duty is to stay with my people, and I will do so. My duty is to protect my country, and I will do so. And as a citizen, I am very, very angry for that. I could even imagine going from where I live somewhere else just because Putin decided that he wants to deny Ukraine and Ukrainians the right for existing.
And just finally, do you think, we've seen President Zelensky make a statement this morning, it seems clear he is still here. Do you think he will also stay, or do you think he would go and maybe set up some sort of government in exile?
Like these last 2 days are the times where I'm an opposition politician. I'm very proud of the President Zelensky. So I wish him strength, and he has all our support because we are all fighting for each other. And I hope that he wouldn't flee. We are all here, and this is our land, this is our soil, and we just have no right to take a step back.
All right, Kira, it's very good to talk to you, and maybe we'll check in with you tomorrow and see how things are going. But thank you for being with us. Kira Rudik there, a politician here in Kyiv. And I've got to say, a lot of politicians, a lot of MPs are not only staying, but we interviewed one, Neil, in Kyiv. He was walking through Kyiv and he had an AK-47 with him strapped across his shoulder and said he would fight. And a lot of the MPs are staying and saying that they will fight. So that is the picture here. But as I say, a really big assault that was predicted last night, a massive assault on this. There have been attacks, make no mistake, but the big assault on this city has not happened as yet. And mercifully, of course, it won't. Neil, back to you to have a look at the papers.
Mark, thanks very much. And as Mark was saying there, I think we are all getting an insight into the character of your average Ukrainian. Something we might discuss indeed with our guest this morning to take us through the papers, the former Moscow correspondent for The Guardian, John Steele, and the writer and broadcaster, Benedict Spence. Gents, good to see you again. Jonathan, let's come to you first this time. We're looking at The Guardian, and they're reporting on that exodus, as they describe it, to the western borders.
Yes, they've got a very graphic picture of a terrified woman with her small son at Kyiv Central Station, desperately trying to find a place on a train going to western Ukraine. It's just one of many images we've seen of people fleeing the city on foot, even in cars, massive car exodus, and traffic jams, of course, caused by that, and then people piling into trains as well to get to the western part of the country and then go across the border into Poland, Romania, Moldova. which have all said that they will welcome and help and shelter as many refugees as come. So there's no problem of getting a shelter. Once you get there, you will be welcomed, but obviously there's going to be a massive logistical issue of finding places for people to stay. The UN High Commission for Refugees is stepping in, and they're getting tents and other facilities available for people.
Benedict, of course, plenty of Ukrainians, particularly men of fighting age, 18 plus, have stayed to defend the country. We've been seeing President Zelensky, a man clearly possesses some pretty big kahunas, but I mean, your average Ukrainian citizen picking up a gun, many of them without any military experience, you've got to say the same about them as well.
I think so. It's in many ways, one doesn't want to, think of people staying behind to fight and potentially die. But it is, as we said in the last segment, President Zelensky has sort of led by example. He was very calm in the build-up to all of this, sort of downplaying Western fears that an invasion was likely, to keep people calm, to say to people stay at home. And that does mean that there are quite a lot of people who are able to pick up weapons and potentially defend their country. It's not what you want to see, but I do think it's actually what you would expect a lot of people to do in such a situation. And, the flip side of this is, of course, you do see lots of countries, Poland and Slovakia, most notably have thrown open their borders. Matteo Salvini, the Italian right-wing politician who is formerly a very big fan of Putin, has said it is Italy's duty to take in Ukrainians wherever they appear. The major issue now appears to be sort of countries further west, like the UK, potentially like France and Germany, who are not necessarily being as welcoming just yet. So, it remains to be seen whether or not that would be the case. Obviously, it's slightly more pressing for countries like Slovakia and Poland that do share a border to get those people over. But, that's the situation that we find ourselves in right now. Ukraine does have an awful lot of people who are prepared to stay and fight, and that is its best bet right now. That's its only hope, certainly as NATO isn't prepared to commit troops to defend them.
Jonathan, take us to the Telegraph and what they're describing incredibly accurately, of course, as the battle for Kyiv. And it certainly feels that there is an awful lot of significance being attached on the Ukrainian side to being able to repel the Russians and, of course, on the Russian side to continue the advance and perhaps even to take the city.
Well, obviously, the Kyiv is the main goal of President Putin, to try and get in there and then set up some kind of alternative government, which will obviously be considered by most Ukrainians as a puppet and a disgrace and treachery and quislings and all the rest of it. But there is, I think, a big danger, which is that if the Ukrainian resistance continues to be as strong as it apparently is, Putin may start using air power in a dramatic way, and we'll see scenes like we've seen in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, which Putin attacked in the 1990s and 2000, or the cities in Syria, which have been completely destroyed, buildings completely smashed, and population totally evacuated and fleeing. So there's a difficult balance here between resistance that has a chance of winning and resistance that just delays the inevitable, but increases the firepower of the Russians to use air power and really smash the city and disregard any issue of civilian casualties.
Yeah, Benedict, I mean, certainly we were listening to Mark Austin speaking to the Defence Minister, James Heappey, a little bit earlier on today. They are certainly planning, looking at planning, the contingency planning for arming, assisting, whatever kind of resistance movement steps up. But we shouldn't forget, I mean, perhaps the biggest tool that we have at our disposal remains sanctions, and one suspects that there will be even more of those.
Yeah, it's difficult because there's been a lot of sort of hue and cry about some countries not putting in enough, not doing enough to impose sanctions. I mean, you've got the slightly farcical and outrageous situation of Belgium asking for exemptions on diamond sales to Russians and Italy for luxury goods. Clearly Prada and diamonds are very important to people right now. Yeah, but if you want to park those and look at slightly more serious things, it is a difficult balancing act simply because Russia has sort of embedded itself so firmly in key aspects of the global economy. We talk a lot about fuel in the West, but actually, the key thing I think to look at is human fuel, it's food, it's agricultural fertilizers, it's wheat. Were sanctions to be stepped up too massively, you could see these things being reduced in their supplies to Western countries, to Eastern countries, to countries in Africa. And the problem is there, we saw Imran Khan, he was in Moscow yesterday, sort of kissing the Muscovite ring, and you're thinking, what a bizarre time to be doing that. But that is, of course, because Pakistan, in terms of its food supply, is rather precarious. And we do need to remember that even in this country, people are only ever a couple of paychecks away from food poverty. That is the sort of thing that leads to regime change. That's something, sadly, that Ukraine knows all too well about. And that's the thing. Right now, as much as you want to put sanctions in place, you don't want to ramp them up so quickly to cause a response that then leads to a massive draining of support for any action against Russia in Western countries and elsewhere, because that's a surefire thing to make sure that Ukraine falls and that there will be nobody offering even military assistance in the form of goods and aid.